As I said, good day to everyone, whatever part of the day it is for you. Welcome to this morning's presentation. This is session 4 of the Building Block Seminar Series. This series of events looking at transitioning in a recovering world is put on by the Climate Investment Funds as part of London Climate Action Week. For those who have been able to participate, we've had some excellent discussions so far in the other 3 sessions that were hosted. Those were on topics of clean energy transition, scaling up finance through financial intermediation, and smart cities. Today, we're looking forward to capping it off with a session titled Choosing the Right Path to Recovery, Industrial Decarbonization, as you can see on the screen here. Let me briefly introduce the Climate Investment Funds, or CIF. For those who don't know us, the CIF is an $8 billion fund. Sorry, could everyone please mute so that we reduce feedback? Thank you. As I was saying, the CIFs are an $8 billion fund that for over a decade has been focused on driving climate action through investments and advisory financing for clean energy, sustainable transport, resilience, and forestry activities globally. Our business model works through 6 multilateral development banks to provide large amounts of finance that is risk-bearing, patient, and at below market rates to support projects in the areas that I just mentioned. We recently entered a new phase of our work as we just passed the first decade of our operations, and we have been developing some new programs that are worth highlighting for this discussion. Last year, 2019, the CIF launched a dedicated facility that offers technical assistance funding for accelerating clean energy investments in client countries. The CIF TA facility supports upstream activities that lead to the strengthening of policy and regulatory environment, building of human and institutional capacity, and design of market-facing solutions such as innovative instruments and business models, all leading to scaling up clean energy. That has particular salience in this discussion, which we'll get to. This year, our governing board recently approved 4 new investment programs, one of which is focused on decarbonizing hard-to-abate industries, which helped inspire today's session. You can find more about all our programs by visiting our website at www.climateinvestmentfunds.org. I want to just very quickly introduce you to our new program because I think it'll set the stage for the discussion that we're about to have. Our new program responds to issues that sometimes can get overlooked in the larger discussion on climate action. Industry currently accounts for 28% of global CO2 emissions and could become the biggest source of global emissions in less than a decade without intervention. The idea behind our new program is that concessional finance may be able to help nudge energy-intensive industries to invest and build back from the COVID-19 crisis in ways that reduce emissions, generate new jobs, and better position business models and workers to tackle future crises. The CIF industry program is being designed to help targeted industries overcome major challenges in the clean energy transition and scaling up investments. It aims to provide access to finance, enhance regulatory and policy frameworks, give incentives to deploy innovative clean technologies, and develop firms' capacity and skills. Our program will look to support different interventions at corporate, sectoral, and national levels. But one of the challenges we face is determining how we can be most effective with a limited amount of concessional resources. I think that feeds into the larger question that we all should consider, which is how can we collectively move past nudging industries onto low carbon pathways and really scale up changes that can adequately respond to the climate crisis in the midst of also responding to the COVID-19 crisis? That's sort of the question that we've asked our panelists to deal with today. Before we get to them, let me just give some logistical details for everyone here. We have 5 distinguished speakers with us today. We'll start with some remarks to help set the stage, followed by interventions from our 4 panelists, and we'll follow that up with Q&A at the end. For those who have questions that come up, please submit them at any time. The way to do that is to go to the chat window in the right-hand corner, the right bottom corner. If you need to bring it up, the little word bubble on the bottom will help you do that. And search the drop-down list for my colleague, Wei-Ting Li. Send questions to her, and she will forward them to me, and I'll be able to send them to the panel. I want to quickly introduce our panel, although I'll allow them to introduce themselves. In our setup speech, we have Paul Durant, who is the head of end-use sectors and bioenergy at ARENA. He'll start things off for us today, and then we'll move to our panel where we have Ajay Mathur, who is the Director General of TERI India, Dimitri Koufos, the lead direct finance and associate director of energy efficiency and climate change at EBRD, Svante Axelsson, national coordinator for fossil-free Sweden, and Sabine Bassinat, the senior energy efficiency specialist for the Green Climate Fund. As our conversation is going, if you'd like to tweet about the webinar, please use hashtag building blocks and tag CIF_action. You can also find us on other social media platforms as well. Once again, thank you for being here, and we're looking forward to a robust discussion. Let me kick it over to Paul to help set the stage and really help us think about how we can get industries onto low carbon or zero carbon pathways. Paul, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. As I've been introduced already, but I'm Paul Durant. I'm head of end-use sectors and bioenergy in IRENA's Innovation and Technology Centre based in Bonn, Germany. 20 years in the UK government, including work on energy and innovation policy prior to this. So my goal with today's presentation is to provide some context for the discussion that you're going to hear afterwards, drawing on IRENA's recent analysis. Next slide, please. So in IRENA, our role is to help our 162 member countries and the wider community make full and effective use of renewables in their energy transition. We published an annual roadmap out to 2050. This year's was called the Global Renewables Outlook, and that sets out an emission reduction pathway compatible with the Paris Agreement's goal of well below 2 degrees. That's the middle bar that you see on the screen there. We have that analysis broken down also by region as well. However, in the context of industry and decarbonisation, the policy context is changing. As we've better understood the consequences of 2-degree rise, a growing number of countries are supporting the more ambitious goal of having a high likelihood of holding temperature rises to no more than 1.5 degrees. Now, achieving that will require a concerted effort to reach, or at least get very close to, net zero global CO2 emissions across all sectors of the economy by 2050 at the latest, and that includes the industrial sectors. We really see the momentum behind that goal growing, with notable pledges just in the last few weeks from China, from Japan, from the Republic of Korea. There are now over 30 countries plus the EU with political commitments to net zero, and some of them have written them into law. The changes underway in the US, all of the G7 nations will have some form of net zero pledge, and we're seeing a number of regions, cities, companies following that lead and setting their own net zero goals. So countries are really starting to get to grips with the planning of what that means, but it's really early days, and I think there's still a lack of a lot of detail behind what is needed to actually deliver on those political pledges. One thing that is clear is that renewables will play a critical role. Direct electrification will be the dominant energy vector. Next, oh, sorry, stick with that slide. Back one slide, please. Thank you. But we also need to understand the role of renewable fuels, particularly hydrogen, and how to utilize hydrogen and its derivatives to best effect, but also not neglecting the optimum use of biomass. Now, our 2020 GROW analysis included for the first time perspectives on that reaching zero emissions, and that's the bar you see at the bottom there. You can see the breakdown across the different sectors, with renewables playing a large role and contributions from other technologies. We've been subsequently building on that analysis, including in the report we published back in September, the Reaching Zero with Renewables report, which delved into some critical end-use sectors, the most challenging, to explore the options available. Next slide, please. Now, this is not the focus of my presentation, but I thought it was just worth mentioning in passing that we've also looked at the implications of that goal in terms of investment. And the thing I want to highlight is that the difference between our 2-degree scenario in the middle and the zero emission scenario compatible with 1.5 degrees is an additional $20 trillion cumulative over the next 30 years. Next slide, please. So why focus on industry? Well, for some sectors, power, to some extent personal transport, we have a reasonable understanding now of what the solutions look like. Delivering rapidly at scale will certainly be challenging. The options and the broad pathway to follow is fairly clear. For some sectors, however, that is not the case. Heavy industry, long-haul transport already account for significant shares of emissions, and under current policies will grow, not shrink. A particular challenge with industry is we must address both emissions from energy use and process emissions as well. If we look across all industries, emissions were 10.4 gigatons in 2017, 28% of all energy and process emissions. In our planned energy scenario, that's based on current policies, that would actually grow to 11.4 gigatons by 2050. And within that, 4 sectors account for 3/4 of the emissions. So a very high share: iron and steel, chemicals and petrochemicals, cement and lime, and aluminium. Progress in these sectors has been very limited to date. We've seen some efficiency improvements, primarily driven by economics rather than climate concerns. Crucially, so far, we've seen very low shares of renewables in use. Renewables has not really been exploited in these industry sectors to date. However, encouragingly, 2 things have been changing in recent years. Firstly is that growing political consensus I've already mentioned on the need for all sectors to make deep decarbonization and deep carbon emissions reductions. Secondly is the rapid decline in the costs of renewables over the last decade and the further potential for cost reductions that we see as we scale up renewable deployment. That has opened up options for the use of renewable energy, including in these industrial sectors that were previously dismissed. And our Reaching Zero report shows there's a very high potential for renewables use, indeed much more than previous analysis has identified. Next slide, please. So there are 5 building blocks, if you like, 5 emission reduction measures that together can get us to zero emissions. Renewables accounts for about 46% of the economic emission abatement potential for the 4 industrial sectors I've mentioned. Within that, there's a major role for direct and indirect electrification with renewables, about 30%. Efficiency, circular economy concepts account for another 30%. And then because of that falling renewables cost and the larger role that renewables plays, we see a smaller role for carbon capture, utilization and storage. It will be essential. It is a necessary technology, particularly in certain sectors, but its role may be more limited than perhaps we'd previously concluded. So using these building blocks, we've looked at the options for reaching zero in these sectors. Now, crucially, that goal of reaching zero requires a very different mindset compared to an objective of merely reducing emissions. And in some of the actions and some of the conversations, we see that perhaps that mindset has not been adjusted to reflect the reality that zero is the goal. A lot of the discussions is about partial emissions, small improvements in efficiency, or substituting natural gas for coal. Now, they may have a role, but only if they are part of a long-term pathway to zero. Otherwise, they risk being at best a distraction or at worst locking in emissions. If you apply that filter, if you apply that zero goal, there are really only a small number of currently conceived options in each sector that are consistent with that zero CO2 emissions objective. So let me dive into a couple of sectors then and give you a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. Now, the 4 sectors we're discussing are complex industries with strong competition. They're traded regionally and globally, often low profit margins, issues of volatile demand, often overcapacity in the sector, crucially links to national growth strategies, therefore politically important, and any increases in costs can have a knock-on effect on the wider economy. All of that was complex enough. All of that is made even worse by the pandemic's impact on the global economy. Now, we are seeing some signs of growing awareness of the need for action and some emerging initiatives in countries and companies bringing together leading examples of countries and companies. One such initiative is the Leadership Group on Industrial Transition, led by Sweden and India. But in general, given the more immediate challenges that companies in these sectors face, they're not well incentivized to put sustainability at the forefront of their plans. So there is a strong onus on governments and bodies such as IRENA and institutions such as the CIF to help keep some focus on that zero carbon goal and to help unpack and create the enabling conditions for that transition. So I'm going to illustrate that a little bit with iron and steel. I don't have time to do it equally for the others. I'll touch on chemicals and cement as time allows. Next slide, please. So under current policies, iron and steel will account for 8% of global CO2 emissions by 2050, 2.9 gigatons. Steel is obviously a critical material for industrial development and strategically important for various countries. It's a complex sector, it's strategically important, it's got significant challenges like I alluded to before. Currently, steel production exceeds demand globally, and the pandemic-related downturn is going to further exacerbate that. Steel is often also a football in, if you like, in trade disputes. The US, for example, imposed import tariffs on steel, which resulted in tit-for-tat tariff impositions from other regions. All of that makes it hard to take action on emissions. Let's look at the options and the choices to be made in the steel sector. As with all sectors, efficiency needs to be the starting point. Now, energy efficiency certainly can help, particularly in terms of reducing costs, or as an interim measure to reduce emissions in the very short term. But it's not a strategy for getting us to zero. Material efficiency is more critical. So as countries develop, they can expect their demand to grow. So this is not about preventing growth, but about mitigating the size of that growth whilst not harming economic development is the tricky balance. So looking at changes in construction techniques and crucially by maximizing the utilization of scrap steel. Utilization of scrap steel is far more energy efficient to recycle than the production of new steel. It's already generally recycled at fairly high rates, but there is still some scope to go further, particularly as steel use in developing countries comes through the point at which it can be recycled. Beyond that, however, there are various steel production routes, but if our focus is on getting close to zero emissions, we have to kind of cut through the distractions of some of the niche options. Basically, our choice boils down to two main options, the renewables route or the carbon capture and storage route. Next slide, please. Both of these options are technically viable. They're based on established technologies, but neither are well developed or ready for mass scale up. There are, in each case, only a couple of pilots or operational plants anywhere in the world. And both have significant implications for infrastructure, be it power supply, hydrogen supply, the transportation and storage of CO2. Talking briefly about the CCS route, its big advantage is it can be applied to existing processes. However, capture rates are only 90%. There's only one operational steel plant using CCS anywhere in the world right now. That's in the UAE. There are plans in development, but in the interim, the costs and the practicalities remain somewhat uncertain. And attention needs to be given to that CO2 transportation and storage infrastructure. Looking at the renewables route, the direct reduced iron and then onward processing in an electric arc furnace is an established technology, typically using methane or a combination of methane and hydrogen. It can be constructed to operate with green hydrogen. The challenge there is we need a supply of clean hydrogen. The supply of that hydrogen and the costs associated with it are currently challenging. This is where low-cost renewable electricity can be an important game changer for green hydrogen and therefore steel production. We estimate the cost difference to a traditional blast furnace is equivalent to a carbon price around $67 per ton of CO2 right now. Falling costs of renewables and crucially falling costs of the electrolyzers needed to produce green hydrogen can narrow that gap perhaps to the point at which by 2050 we are competitive. There's a couple of pilots underway, both in Europe, one in Sweden, one in Germany, but they're still really much in the early stages. One interesting thing about DRI is it potentially opens up some changes in trade. So and new export opportunities. So green hydrogen-based direct reduced iron could be produced in areas where they have high renewable resources, high and low cost renewable resources, and also potentially iron ore resources. And then the DRI is exported to other countries for onward processing into steel. That could create some interesting dynamics and overall could be economically attractive. Just very briefly, something about timings and priorities, and then I will need to wrap up. So time is against us with a 2050 target. Neither of these routes is yet well established. Steel plants are major capital investments with long lifetimes. So some smart planning, some thinking about the sequencing of investment decisions and endeavoring to try and future-proof choices is key. 2020 is the decade for consolidating changes in the power sector and preparing for the deep decarbonization of other sectors. By 2030, if the steel sector is going to be close to fully decarbonized by 2050, by 2030, we're going to need to see any new plants installed at that point be compatible with zero emissions. They don't have to be zero emissions at that point in time, but they need to be compatible. So for example, they don't have to use 100% green hydrogen at the starting point, but could transition to green hydrogen over time, or potentially could have CCS retrofitted. But the key thing is to make choices in the 2020s that allow us to understand what's needed and the choices of plants. So location of plant for ready supply of green hydrogen or for ready access to CO2 transportation and storage will be crucial for their future decarbonisation. Just looking at priorities, we need many more demonstration plants in the next decade to give us the learning and the insights and the confidence needed. We need to create early sources demand for clean steel. We need further R&D on key aspects, particularly to reduce cost, both for the steel production, but also for supply chains in hydrogen. And we need to be working more closely together because this is an internationally traded commodity. If one country moves too fast ahead of the others, it causes competitiveness issues that disincentivize everyone. So I'm out of time, sadly. So let me just wrap up. Next slide, please. The point about cement and lime is similar, but perhaps even more complex. So you can skip ahead 4 slides. Similarly with chemicals. So we'll stick back one side. Thank you. This is the final point I want to make. I kind of addressed this already, but there are a number of key dimensions that we need to be looking at in terms of priorities for action. Clearer long-term strategies co-developed between industry and government. Focus on those enabling conditions of the infrastructure for power and hydrogen supply. Some further innovation. Incentivizing business models with things like a demand for green products, and crucially that international collaboration. Last slide, please. Finally, there's a lot of things we don't know. I won't go through all of this, but there's still plenty that we need to focus on to understand the right choices. But we have a sense of the direction, and that allow us to inform the decisions we make in the next decade. And final slide. We've got work coming up in IRENA that will help on this. Do watch out for it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. It was a really good in-depth discussion and, clearly a lot more to cover, which hopefully we'll be able to cover in coming days and weeks. I think a point that you made that was really useful is energy efficiency is the place to start, both from energy perspective and from a materials perspective. I'll turn it over to Ajay, who will be providing us the perspective from India, where implementation of energy measures, particularly in industry, have been key, is my understanding, to help reduce its energy intensity over the past decade. So Ajay, please take it away and share the experience in India.
Thanks ever so much, Daniel. I'm going to repeat a lot of what Paul said. It's a matter of complete identification with his findings. But I think the point remains that we are at a situation where we have to look at an end game. where we are working without fossil fuels at all. So energy efficiency is important. Energy efficiency, as you rightly said, is the first step. But what next? Next slide, please. What we are looking at is replacing the fossil fuels that we have today. And in India, we use a wide variety of them with a future in which our assessment, Terry's assessment, shows it's based on renewable electricity. So electrify as much as you can. Whatever you can't, use green hydrogen produced, as Paul mentioned, through the electrolysis of water using renewable electricity. And apart from hydrogen, the other fuel is biomass-based fuel. I'm a little conflicted on biomass-based fuels because biomass-based fuels can be converted into aviation fuel. And we really don't have any option for aviation fuel apart from this. Whereas for all other applications for which biomass-based fuels are used, you could have other options. So I'll leave it there. Clearly, as we move along, as we find new technologies, new solutions, this is an area to watch. But the point is, we are looking at replacing a suite of fossil-based fuels by a few renewable sources. Next, please. So what are the challenges? In our view, there are many places where renewable electricity is already cost-effective. Challenge, therefore, is to scale it and scale it now. What are these options? The first is, as I said, electrification. Now, for a variety of historic reasons, the prices of electricity, particularly for industry in India, tend to be high. And consequently, if there's on-site solar production, it provides electricity at a price which is far lower than what is paid to the grid. And consequently, it makes sense to change today's use, but also change tomorrow's use. We did a exercise looking at the small industry cluster just outside Calcutta, and it came out that there were a large number of applications. So first of all, technologically, there were a very large number of applications which could either use electricity or could use hydrogen. But the interesting thing was, it was cost effective to electrify many of them. Fuel oil-based foundries, forklifts, electrical foundries. So things which needed a lot of heat or a lot of motive power and were based on petroleum were clear winners. But even when you are replacing electricity by solar electricity, which is generated on site, there was a clear cost effectiveness. So why does this not take off? We believe that this is, number one, because of the lack of demonstrations of technology. We have worked in the cluster outside Calcutta earlier when we were working on changing foundries. And what we learned was that once you demonstrate and build the local capacities, it multiplies like mushrooms. So the first thing I think we need to focus on is technological demonstrations, that these things work. The second is this needs money. Now, because of the COVID crisis, the economic stimulus package that has been offered provides collateral-free loans, credit on the debt side, not equity, which is available especially to the SME sector. So all this can be used, but then you need green equity which will support green projects that can draw the credit that is available. So if we can do that, that's great. The third thing that we learned from our earlier experience was that the people who needed to be trained most, obviously the guys who work in the SMEs, but even more than that were the people who work in the banks who lend for this. You need to build up their skills, their ability to evaluate projects for which they are providing the financing. We believe that this is something that can be done now. At the same time, in line with what Paul said, we need to start working on developing technologies for green hydrogen, RE+. So clearly, bringing down electrolyzer costs is important, because if you're working on solar, the electrolyzers work for 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours a day, which means that costs have to be minimized, because those costs have to be apportioned over the hydrogen produced over those 5, 6, 7 hours. Cost reduction of electrolyzers is amazingly important. Similarly, hydrogen-based steel making technologies that Paul talked about, we won't focus on that. We know what is happening in the world. And similarly, zero carbon-based cement, where the CO2 which is produced by the calcination of lime needs to be somehow removed. Today, carbon capture, utilization, and storage is the only way forward. But those are things we need to invest now if we are ready for them to become business models tomorrow. Next, please. Now, the provision of hydrogen or the provision of renewable electricity means that we need infrastructure. It makes sense to build that infrastructure now, but obviously nobody is going to fund that infrastructure if it's not going to be for the 10 years that it takes for the hydrogen-based steel technology to come in. Consequently, we need to build it where there is a demand. So starting out with clusters, and that is why the first slide was important, you look at places where it makes economic sense. And there are many, many places in India and in other developing countries where it makes sense to move to these technologies. Move to those technologies, build this infrastructure there, it'll pay for itself. And then it can grow over time as the hydrogen-based steel technologies, as the fertilizer technologies, the plastics technologies, Paul talked about many of them. As they become viable, this cluster, this infrastructural cluster will grow. The point is, we need to invest in them today and continue to tomorrow. I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ajay. Really great presentation. I think it's good to hear that the capacity is there. We just need to find ways to support it. Something I've heard through both presentations so far is the need for long-term planning, which is a good segue to turn to Dimitri for EBRD. EBRD is kind of positioning itself as a leader with its green economy transition plan. And so I'd like you to talk about sort of what the experience is and how that can lead to industrial decarbonization and how EBRD can support it. Because another point that Ajay brought up, which is really important, is sort of financiers on the ground need to understand how things work, and that sometimes requires the technical assistance that institutions like EBRD can provide. Dimitri, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you both Paul and Ajay for the very good presentations and for setting the scene for me to make the introductory of how EBRD and the MDB world can support this. Next slide, please. Now, just as an introduction, and since we've been talking technical skills, by training and background, I'm an engineer, a chemical engineer. I've worked in various types of these very challenging industry to decarbonize over the last 25, 30 years. For the last 10 years, I've assumed the responsibility here within EBRD on the energy efficiency side in the industrial sector. And my motto in the bank is I'm an engineer trying to make an impact in a finance world. So with that said, I'm just going to give you an initial description of the timeline of the EBRD's evolution in the green space. Over the last years, we've invested over 35 billion in 2,000 green projects since 2006, when we established at that time our Sustainable Energy Initiative. That has evolved over the years to lead to about an average of 40% of our annual business volume as classified as green, and which is in line with the MDB methodology for joint climate finance tracking. That covers energy efficiency, water efficiency, resource efficiency, environmental projects. This year, we've released a new strategy that will focus in the period of 2021 to 2025, in which we've publicly disclosed that at least 50% of our projects will be classified as green, and with the focus will be on low carbon roadmaps, climate corporate governance, green finance innovation, but also will take into account other areas such as the concessional financing that is needed from partners like the GCF, the CIF, the JEF, the EU, working with other MDBs in this area, of course, taking into account the COVID response and other areas of the transition story that we need to build on, such in particularly job creation, gender considerations. Moving on to the next slide, please. So with that in mind, the GET proposal we put forward has three basic elements. The first element is the policy engagement at a very high level, which focuses on the long-term strategies and green financial systems that need to be put in place and building the capacity and awareness for climate risk management. The second element is the Paris alignment. We intend to specifically screen our investments to be Paris aligned, increasing the capacity of the organization that we're financing, the country and the region, to develop the corresponding low carbon roadmaps and strategies to materialize this, and what additional finance is needed to work around that. And the third key element is the thematic areas. That thematic areas cover what we believe the entire economic activity of where the EBRD's intervention can be mostly impactful, with a view to contribute to a net zero carbon world by 2050. Next slide, please. Now, in this slide, you will see a little bit more substance on what these thematic areas are, but they range from the sustainable connectivity, industrial decarbonization, sustainable food systems, natural capital, green buildings, cities and infrastructure and environmental infrastructure, energy systems integration, and green financial systems. Within that, we have a specific theme dedicated to industrial decarbonization, which we view as supporting the low carbon economy, circular material products, and the related services. Next slide, please. So how do we define our industrial decarbonization platform? It has three basic building blocks. The first one is sustainable and circular raw materials. The EBRD is working by definition in a world that's very mining intensive and therefore has a big impact on the elements that need to be supplied into the low carbon world. So therefore, the critical raw materials that have an essential role in driving the low carbon future are important for us, but we'll have to incorporate climate change mitigation and resilience aspect to new circular business models, minimize environmental impact, and improve resource efficiency and productivity, while deploying new waste management techniques, tailings management, and business models. The second element is low carbon production and transformation. The decarbonization of the industrial plants, on the processing plants, will have to be developed based on low carbon roadmaps, which is basically the outcome that Paul described earlier in his presentation. We'll have to identify for each sector, for each country, for each organization, the pathway that they need to define themselves and the target setting of achieving this long-term carbon neutral position, while maximizing resource efficiency and integrating new circular business models. The third critical element is the circular and low carbon product applications and services. Now, application of new low carbon products and related services within the business models, we are embarking on this in view of new technological advancements and new products that need to be placed into the market to provide a more sustainable footprint. And as an example, and in India is probably one of the good examples for this, is the introduction of new low carbon cements into the market. For example, calcined cement has a role to play, and we see these areas of new low carbon products and the associated services that need to be developed as a critical engagement going forward for us. What we are trying to aim with this industrial decarbonization platform that will set the scene for selectively addressing the financing needs that we need to focus on is that it will have to be systematic across all industries, across all sectors. It will have to be accelerative, which means we need to bring forward all the targets and all the goals in order to make sure that we do not lose this decade. And we have to be transformative in the nature of the corporates and the projects. And the key objective would be to integrate climate risk considerations and opportunities at the core business model of every organization and to support the changing consumer behavior within each organization that we finance. Now, we put this forward because the EBRD was set up quite some time ago as an institution to support the countries of the ex-Soviet bloc to move into the market economy, and therefore it carries a legacy of a very diverse industrial base, ranging from very integrated operational companies in very energy and intensive material resources on industrial commodities, such as companies in Kazakhstan or Ukraine, but in countries well integrated with the value chains for just transition, just in lead time, such as companies operating in Poland, Slovakia, and Turkey, with a predominance in SMEs and light manufacturing. Now, throughout our region, energy-intensive and resource materials processes have typically shown a very high carbon intensity rather than the advanced industrial economies and much lower productivity, therefore. So the rate of adoption of energy efficiency technologies and practices remains very well behind in the region that we operate comparable to international markets, and especially in SMEs. One particular point of importance for us is circular business models. Because they're rare, the regulatory systems are not supporting them, the decarbonization efforts and the circular economy aspects are very weak apart from the EU countries that we operate. So we believe that this challenging business environment and the industrial decarbonization platform we have presented here will present the basis upon which we will deploy our financing at 50% of our annual business volume, considering also the interlinked value chains that Paul mentioned in the beginning. So we do have some challenges that we're facing in this role. And the challenges are imposed by the increased risk of stranded assets. Both presenters before me mentioned this, and the support of a just transition. So the proximity to critical markets, the access to raw materials, relatively well-developed infrastructure, the availability of skilled workforce, the potential to develop sustainable and competitive industrial systems, new value chains, along with the accelerated adoption of energy efficiency practices, new greenfield plants with full decarbonization potential, the accelerated use of industrial processes electrified, introduction of hydrogen into a low carbon footprint, the introduction of practice and models to facilitate circular business models with recycling and reuse of products, all the critical elements that we want to build through this industrial decarbonization platform. We're working with various other MDBs in this front and with the various other co-financiers, and we hope that we'll be able to deliver this model within the next period that we're working up until 2025, and have the ability to show that 50% of our annual business model is dedicated to these types of activities. With that, I'd like to close, and thank you very much for your time today and for listening in, and happy to answer any questions.
Dimitri, thank you so much. Really excellent presentation. It's great to see what EBRD is doing with the industrial decarbonization platform. I think a key element that you mentioned is sort of that there's a lot of opportunity within existing systems, but sometimes that is affected by the existing policies and government sort of playing catch up with where the technology is going, where the industry is moving. So with that, let's turn to Svante to hear a little bit about what governments can do and, sort of forward-leading governments like the Swedish government, how their industrial initiatives can help with decarbonization. Svante, please take it away.
Thank you very much for being invited to this seminar. Can you hear me, yes?
Yes, you sound great.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, great. I'm Svante Axelsson. I'm a national coordinator for Fossil Free Sweden. It's a governmental initiative to promote the transition of the Swedish economy. I have a background as an environmental economist and general secretary for the environmental movement for 16 years. And I will very briefly give a picture of what's happening in Sweden just now. The focus in this project, Fossil Free Sweden, is to produce, you can say, roadmaps for fossil-free competitiveness. We have invited many industrial branches, and they voluntarily now have produced 22 different roadmaps. And they are really convinced that fossil-free is a way to increase the competitiveness. They see the possibilities to be in the forefront. And that has really surprised me that they are so convinced about this. And they say that it depends on the Paris Agreement and other targets in different countries. They know that the fossil-free is the only way to be part of the market. So now the situation is that the state need to step up and to help the industry to transform the industry in an open economy. As you know, Sweden is a little country with an open economy and very, very strong export of our economy. So we are vulnerable and we need to reduce risks. So now we say that we have it's need two for a tango to transform these industries. And we say also perhaps we need a square dance, you can say, because all different actors need to support and to be part of this transformation. And the language now from the government is that Sweden want to be the first fossil-free welfare nation. We say that we are going to show other countries that we have a higher welfare depend on that we are fossil-free. So we have changed the logic, you can say, if you compare to the UN agreements that we talk about burden sharing, we talk about possibility sharing and how we can transform this society with support of the people that they believe and feel that the life will be better if we step up and increase transition. So this is very, very good situation for us now. And I mean, that means that state have to take a new role. And we see also that EU have the same strategy. EU wants to be the first climate neutral region in the world. And Timmermans and Ursula von der Leyen is very, very clear about that. It is good for the welfare, for the competitiveness and to modernize the whole EU. So when we see this win-win solution, I mean, climate issues in Sweden now is more about how can we increase the export, how can we increase the competitiveness, how can we create job by being fossil free. So now we have produced these 22 roadmaps, and they are the roadmaps, you can say, is based on biofuel, biomass, electricity, and efficiency. And they have rather strong targets now. The first fossil-free steel we will have 2026 in Sweden. It's because of this green hydrogen, and we have a lot of fossil-free electricity, so we can produce this green hydrogen. And we see that the price is going down because of the low price on renewables, but also low price on what's the name in English? I don't know how you can produce this green hydrogen. And we think that the green hydrogen will have the same price as natural gas 2028. And that's why we now are going to produce a green strategy for Sweden. And we have the application, of course, in trucks, but also in biorefineries, aviation, agriculture, and then different chemical industries. So we have a lot of consumers, you can say, that want to use this rather cheap green hydrogen. The construction roadmap and sector believe that they are now going to reduce the emissions by 50% to 2030. And the construction emissions is 20% of the Swedish total emissions of carbon gases. We also can see that domestic aviation will be fossil-free totally 2030. The heat sector will be fossil-free 2030. The transport sector will be reduced emissions by 70% to 2030. Mostly from electric cars, of course. We believe that 80% of new cars 2030 will be electric. 50% of all new trucks will be electric trucks 2030. And we now change and put biodiesel and other things into fuel and gasolines, and we need to produce these biofuels by ourselves because there are a lot of rest products in the forest. So the task now in a global perspective is that we can stress this transition and also lower the cost and bend the learning curve. And that's the most interesting thing to do now. So we can spread out this new technology much cheaper. I mean, the rich countries need to be in the forefront and pay for this more costly electric cars and biofuels or whatever. So the task is to increase the scale and bend the learning curve so other countries could have a cheaper and a more fair way to transform their society. So now we have going to produce some strategies, and I mentioned hydrogen strategy, I mentioned also bio strategy, and also battery strategy, because we see a lack of sustainable batteries, and we are going to change our minds so the batteries will be better and better. And we think the business case is rather good now, because the car producers are very keen on to have total fossil-free automobiles, you can say. So the value change is already there. When I talk with some companies that produce and will produce fossil-free steel, they say the market is already here. We can get something like 25% more for fossil-free steel today. And we see the same discussion when we talk about batteries. So that's an easier way now that we have so strong, you can say, demand, consumer willingness to pay when we talk about products in the whole society. We can also see that the state could reduce risks by put more stronger targets and also sector targets that will decrease the risks. We have a lot of money in the system, but we need also to take risks. Strong climate policy, reduce risks. Investment support that we now have in Sweden and EU, and especially now after the corona, we have a lot of money. We want to put guarantees into the market from the banks, but also from the state, and also use the public procurement, of course, to take responsibility to make a market for these new products. So if I sum up this story now, I think it's we have a good mood, we have a strong support, and the most interesting thing is that the leaders of the companies is rather what you say, afraid of that the transition will be too slowly. So their focus is now to step up in the parliament and take the decisions much faster, and also give permits much faster. So that's the bottleneck just now. But it's a totally changed discussion compared to 10 years ago when we talk about global cost-effective solutions. Now we talk, how can we change our society that we can create more jobs and better products for the whole world. Thank you.
Excellent, Svante. Thank you very much. It's really great to see, hear about Sweden sort of blazing the path to zero carbon economy. And it's impressive what can be done when governments step up and take the lead. And as we've heard, they play a key role in moving things forward on this front. But another key that we've heard is we need the money and we need the financing to move things along. And so for our last intervention, I turn to Sabine from our sibling institution at the Green Climate Fund to tell us a little bit how financing can help, what types of financing we think can be most effective to help get the decarbonization of these hard to abate industries really moving on the timeframes that we need to see. Sabine, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And it's a pleasure to be here in this presentation and this seminar. The industry sector for me, it's a passion. I've been at this since almost 20 years, so it's a labor of love. Let's just go with that. I mean, I think one of the key things that we heard from Paul, as well as the whole move towards decarbonization, where we need large industries to really energy-intensive industries to move towards decarbonization. I think this whole thing is, as we're looking at decarbonization, I think the pathways to decarbonization is really first starting off with energy efficiency, and then moving forward, and then having a plan reaching that 2050 target that he mentioned. And I think that this is critical, and I think we've done some bits, but I think we still have a long ways to go to really kind of make things happen. Just to kind of give you an idea, I mean, when I started off as an energy auditor in 2000, what I was doing was, I was actually selling energy efficiency. I mean, I had to convince industries that I went to that, energy efficiency was good, and then you needed to do energy efficiency. And then now in 2020, when I went into an industry, I was no longer selling energy efficiency. I mean, I was so happy to see that, there were things already being done, but now what I was trying to sell was, how do we now implement energy efficiency? How do we actually implement the ideas that were coming out from the industries to really get those things, on the ground and really moving at a pace that was, that's needed to meet this 2050 target that we saw from Paul again. So, I mean, I think this is very critical. And that this is where the GCF is really trying to head towards as well, is to really kind of, as a climate fund, we are really trying to basically move the markets into an area where we can really use our funds as a catalytic agency to basically get more private sector capital in place, as well as really move the markets into the area that's needed to really kind of get to that net zero. Next slide, please. So I mean, this slide is really, I mean, it's just a offshot of everything that's been shown by both Paul as well as Dr. Mathur. But the two things that I just wanted to kind of focus on is, as you can see, I mean, a bulk of the GHG emissions are coming from the big three, the cement, steel, and the chemicals. But the livelihoods, the whole economic activities globally is run through SMEs, MSMEs. I mean, I don't know what the nomenclature in your area is, CSIs, cottage industry. So I call them my big ones. I mean, they're still a big portion of that, and those this SMEs also need to be part of this conversation to really kind of foster the net zero as well. So I think that this is where I think we're also trying to, as much as we're focusing on the big three, we would also need to focus on the big one as well to really kind of get that transition going. And then so this is where I would like to kind of focus you on the bottom left part of the slide, where there's a couple of equipment. So when we're looking at scaling, I mean, when you look at an industry, and then when you're when we're trying to basically do energy audits, you may be looking at a steel cement company, but one cement company in the same area and another cement company just next door, they're totally different. So the customization that's needed is very different. So I mean, therefore, getting to that scale potential is quite difficult. And so that's why one of the things that we're really focusing on is the equipment side of things. If we can basically get motors to be efficient at a certain level, and those being implemented in the different industrial settings, boilers at a certain efficiency level being implemented, and that way I think we would be able to kind of reach scale in some aspects, and then really kind of drive the change towards net zero. Next slide, please. So now, having said that, I mean, so yes, obviously there are barriers in place, and then I think as much as we'd like to say that energy efficiency has happened, there are, I mean, it's not happening as fast as we want it to happen as well. And then for that, I mean, there's a couple of barriers that I've seen in my past 20 years of experience, as well as my other colleagues that work in the sector as well. One is on the policy side. I mean, there are policies in place, but these policies are very overarching, and then the implementation and the enforcement of these policies are not seen that much. I mean, one great thing that we've seen is from Dr. Mathur, and in India, where they have the PAT scheme, which is very effective in terms of really kind of getting industries into action through the policies. But the enforcements cost money, so therefore that needs to be taken account of, and then therefore having a good policy is good, but at the same time enforcing that policy is another issue altogether. And then the second part is the financiers. Now, I know Dr. Mathur said we need the bankers to be trained. Yes, the bankers need to be trained, but at the same time we can't make bankers into energy engineers. So what we need to also think about is, how do we make a banker's life easier? I mean, I think the analogy that I always take is, we need to make energy efficiency and decarbonization as easy as buying a car. I mean, bankers know how to sell car finance, because I mean, they don't know the nitty-gritties of a car, but they know that they can sell the car. So I think that's what we really need to do, is we need to really kind of have the the standards, the practice in place when a banker sees a motor with a 99% efficiency label and from this manufacturer, then he knows that, okay, yes, this is something that we can finance under our credit line, or this is something that we can finance under our de-risking scheme. So we need to make the banker's life much more easier. And then the money is there, but we just need to make sure that the right elements are in place that makes it happen. And then I think the biggest barrier for energy efficiency, from my perspective, is these eyes, the visibility. I mean, energy efficiency, decarbonization in the industries, these are things that are so inherent to the industry that only the people in the industry and people that are associated with the industries know how good they are, and the effects that are that it's creating, right? So that level of visibility, that because we're all humans. I mean, one of the best things about us being humans is that you like a pat on the back when you've done something good. And I think that's needed, right? So I mean, when you're looking at, let's just say, and the renewable space, putting up a huge solar, array, and then if someone walks by and they say, oh yeah, this company has a solar array. I mean, yeah, they're doing great things, but that company could have done 20 different things to make that company, net zero in terms of energy, but no one would really see it. And then that's really kind of, hindering the adaptation of energy efficiency and the move towards really getting the capital in place. Because I mean, making that leap from just saying, okay, we want to do something, to really getting that done, that's a totally different issue as well, right? So and that needs to happen. And I think the other part that I would also like to mention is just to kind of make this whole ecosystem on the energy on the industry side move. Yes, there are government players that need to be involved. We need policies in place, but at the same time, one of the key things that you will see, I mean, and then there's something that Dimitri also talked about, is the whole materials flow economy as well, is to really kind of make that whole ecosystem more effective. There are corporates that are also getting involved as well. I mean, I in my previous job, I worked with the textile industries, and then the best way that we really could get the textile supply chain in a greener pathway was actually by getting the buyers involved. So we basically had large buyers like Levi's, H&M, Gap, those guys really committing to the sustainability and to the greening of their own supply chain. So though the policies were in place, but a buyer basically saying, for instance, H&M, put into place their 100% renewable plan. I think this was in 2015, and then so due to that, the supply chain was also, I mean, all the SMEs in that supply chain, they were also looking at and asking us, how do we put in this, get into that real, to the 100% renewables? What is the financing that's needed? What are the technical specs that are needed? So therefore, that really kind of moved the mechanism as well. So therefore, I mean, when you're looking at what to do and the policies, I mean, we're really looking at minimum energy performance standards, energy management systems that need to be put in place, fiscal incentives that can really help lessen the gap in the enforcement, so that it happens much more organically. And then for financing, I think what we need is the right type of financing. Debt is not the only solution. You have de-risking. People need to kind of figure out, if a technology is there, how do we finance it, and what are the risk premiums? Can we finance the risk premiums? So de-risking with guarantees, partial risk, that's needed. And then also equity is a huge thing. I think Dr. Mathur also mentioned this. And then also vendor suppliers, and then supplier finance to really get the vendors involved into this. And then so this is what we're doing at the fund as well. We're really kind of working with our countries. We're a country-driven program. And my time is up, so let me just wrap this up. We're a country-driven program, so therefore, we're really working with countries to really develop their minimum energy performance standards through our readiness technical assistance. Each country has $1 million per year that they can use for readiness. And then we have our cooling initiative, where we're really looking at the low GWP refrigerant and then really, bringing that up. And then lastly is partnerships. We're working with partnerships partners with countries, with different accredited entities to really get things going. And all of this really gets into really getting that behavioral change in place. And then final word, and our last board meeting with Dimitri's team in EBRD, we were able to work on a project where it's really working to really enhance behavioral change in the decarbonization of industries. Thank you very much, and I'm 1 minute over time. Sorry about that. I'm looking forward to the questions.
No, Sabine, that was great. I mean, you started off by saying that you're passionate about this topic, and it really shone through in your intervention. It's great to hear all the thoughts and the perspectives that you bring to the table. Really good stuff. And I think one thing that you highlighted is, I mean, what we're talking about here is not just system change in terms of supply chains and industrial processes, but it's almost a cultural change as well, because there are so many parts where interventions can help lead to zero carbon. So it's great stuff. Thank you. Due to the discipline of our panelists, we have some time for questions, which is great. I will take them as they come in. Let me start off with, we've received a couple already, and I ask our panelists to turn on their cameras so that everyone can see them. I think we'll start off. There was a question that was posed for Ajay, which is, where are the biggest policy gaps in putting India on a pathway to decarbonization? Ajay, could you please tell us where you see the big policy gaps in India? Sorry, Ajay, you're on mute. You need to unmute so we can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Go ahead.
So I would reframe the question and look at the past history. So for example, in 2015, when India gave its Paris pledges, there was a very small amount of renewable energy in the country. But it has grown and grown so much that we will probably exceed the target that we had set for ourselves at Paris. I think it's worthwhile seeing how that can happen. So the policy gap is about two things. One is creating demand so that markets build up and prices come down. Ultimately, what matters in India is it competitive? Now, you can fund the hump so that the prices come down, but ultimately it will have to be managed. So the key policy gap in India is, if we look at sectors beyond decarbonization of electricity, the industry sector, for example, we need to have similar demand creation for zero carbon technologies. And they will be needed because they make economic sense. And by the way, excuse me, they also reduce carbon.
Great, thank you, Ajay. Our next question is for Paul. Paul, what kind of upstream actions are required to facilitate scaling up of hydrogen adoption in industries?
Yeah, thank you. And it was fascinating to hear the other presentations. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, well, the quick answer is there are a lot of different things that need to come together. I guess the good news is that we're starting to see a number of governments take a strategic approach to this. Just in the last 18 months or so, we've seen at least a dozen countries publish hydrogen strategies. There's an awful lot of political interest in the topic right now, and they're all trying to sort of create the right framework for hydrogen to play a role in various aspects of the energy system. But industry is at the forefront of that. I'd highlight three areas actually that need particular attention and where some progress has been made, but more is needed. So cost, competitiveness, and confidence. So on the cost side, production of hydrogen, whether it's green through renewables or blue produced from using CCUS, is significantly higher than fossil fuel-based hydrogen, grey hydrogen right now. That cost gap needs to fall. The encouraging sign is that there are ways in which we can do that over the next 2 decades. Just focusing on green hydrogen, it's a combination of a continuing fall in renewables costs, and actually exploiting the best available renewables. So hydrogen production needs to be sited where the costs are lowest, ideally, and then reducing the capital costs of those electrolyzers. And we're actually about to publish a report on this just in a matter of a couple of weeks' time, looking at the potential for doing that. And there is substantial potential, but only with a variety of measures in place. Scaling up the size of the electrolyzers, scaling up manufacturing capacity, some further innovation to shift to some alternative designs, or at least increase the share of those. And these things together will get us to a point in about 20 years where it's cost competitive. That brings me to my second point, competitiveness. In the short to medium term, the use of hydrogen compared to its fossil fuel equivalents will be more expensive. So if we're going to incentivize that, then something needs to be done about mitigating the effects of that. And obviously there's then concerns about competitiveness of countries' industries with their international competitors. Various things being discussed, carbon prices, border carbon adjustments, etc. All of them somewhat problematic right now, but more attention is needed to try and find a way through that. And my very last point is about confidence. There's a lot of stuff we don't know right now. I mentioned in my presentation, there's relatively few demonstrations and pilots out there. We need many, many more of those, and we need to be sharing the learning so that those who have got to make the investment decisions have the information they need to judge the risks and hopefully make the right choices. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate your last point on confidence. It's sort of a question I've had when it comes to hydrogen, which is just more and more a part of the conversation, almost to the point of dominating the conversation. So, my question is, I feel like we've been through the hydrogen hype cycle before with respect to transportation and things like that. And I think your framing is a good way to help us think about it. But, one question I have is sort of, should we think about hydrogen following a similar path that we saw with renewables, where it's really about getting the cost down and there needs to be learning over time and this sort of 20-year glide path that you talked about? Or should we think that it's actually more challenging because there's additional infrastructure demands? You sort of help us think about what that, what it looks like. And then I would also turn it over to other panelists. Paul, why don't you go first?
Yeah, okay. Really interesting question. I think there's a bit of background noise. I don't know if somebody's not muted. So, yeah, yes, we've been here before, 25 years ago. I mean, we do think it is different this time around because crucially what's changed is the need for hydrogen is there, whereas it wasn't there 25 years ago. It was an interesting, exciting fuel, but there wasn't the equivalent policy requirement to reduce emissions. So, that is what crucially has changed. And also the focus of hydrogen use is not about hydrogen cars. We actually don't think that hydrogen is going to have a major role in the personal transport sector, maybe in freight sector. It's going to be used in industry, it's going to be used possibly to some extent in heating, and it's going to be used particularly via production of synthetic fuels in things like shipping and potentially aviation. So that's why it's different. In terms of the parallels with what's happened with renewables generation, well, I mean, I think on the electrolyzer front, we think that there are strong parallels there and that the cost reductions will come from that scale up. Scale drives down costs. We're all familiar with that. And there, from our assessment and assessment of others, there does seem to be a pathway towards affordable green hydrogen production if we can get the scale in place. But yes, as you say, there are some interesting additional wrinkles to that. There's the whole infrastructure necessary for the supply of this. People are looking at the global trade of hydrogen or its derivatives, perhaps like ammonia, and a lot of uncertainties there about how that might work, the trade conditions, etc. So, yeah, it is a bit like solar or wind, but with some bells and whistles that add extra complications.
Great, thanks, Paul. I saw Ajay gesturing. Ajay, do you want to come in on this topic?
Yeah, we have been doing a lot of analysis about hydrogen. And one of the things that has happened now as opposed to 20 years ago is that there is a lot of people, in a sense, crawling out of the woodwork who are on the demand side. The discussion on hydrogen has been, at least till about 10 years ago, focused on the supply side. Now, there's been a great demand for hydrogen in the world all this while, and it is met by the reformation of gas. So that's at $2 per kg. And green hydrogen from photovoltaics, electricity, is at $5.5 per kg. Now, the interesting thing is that there are markets now, and I mentioned some of them, there are markets now where hydrogen at $5.5 a kg makes sense if we can supply it. Access is the key issue. So investing in the infrastructure to provide even the $5.5 per kg hydrogen makes sense. Now, as the volume expands and the price comes down, it comes down. Once you reach 4, there is a new market that opens up, which is the market for the use of hydrogen in a whole range of applications in industrial heating. As it comes down further, you open it up to the prices that are needed for other applications. Come back to me, I'm forgetting it now. And finally, when it comes down to $2, it replaces the use that it is there today in ammonia and fertilizers. The short point that I want to make is that because of this demand at different prices, it makes sense for us to start supplying those markets today. The shifts will occur because of economic reasons. The markets will grow, the prices will fall, and the markets will grow even further. This is very, very much like what happened in renewables. PV was exactly the same. New markets opened up, the prices.
Ajay, we may have lost you. I think we lost your feed, unfortunately. But I think your point came through. It's a very optimistic point. Glad to hear it. So let me hand it over to Svante now, who also wants to come in on this, and we'll see if we can get Ajay reconnected. Svante, go ahead.
Yeah, I have 2 points. The first one, I think the challenge now is to invest in infrastructure. If you talk about electricity infrastructure, but also hydrogen infrastructure. So I mean, the state need to have this arrangement, and I know that different countries have different policies, but if the state want to own this infrastructure, it could also be a sort of bottleneck. So that's a challenge for Sweden just now. The second is to some comments on hydrogen. I really think that it will be a realistic boom this time. And it depends on, as we have heard, that the price is going down on renewables. But I think that the lack of renewables are a sort also of a challenge in different countries. And I don't think that the blue hydrogen will have so big part in this evolution, because the time is going and it's rather slowly to introduce CCS in this system. And the price is going very, very fast down when you talk about electrolyzers. So at that case, I mean, the green hydrogen will take the market, and we believe that it will be, something around 2028. But that the challenge is also here, how can we bend the learning curve? I mean, the state's main task is to bend the learning curves, and what type of subsidies do we need to increase the consumption, as you mentioned here. And I think in some part we can see in when you produce biofuels, or if you produce cars, and that you have a value chain who can pay. But I think also we need to have some type of support system, because it's much more expensive to use green hydrogen today compared to fossil. So that's the question to the other panelists, colleagues here. How can we bend the curve so it could be go by itself 2028?
Yeah, I mean, Svante, that's a really good question. And if I can just build off that quickly, I guess I would turn to our financier colleagues, Sabine and Dimitri. You know, to the extent that these things will be driven by markets, that's really encouraging. But will that be the case in sort of all markets, right? And or is there a push needed in some economies to get things on the low carbon path? And if so, I mean, you both talked about this in your interventions, but where do you see the sort of key areas now where your type of financing and the investments that you both are experts in, where do you think you want to see them delivered in the next 3 or 4 years to sort of complement these market dynamics that we're seeing? We'll start with Dimitri and then go to Sabine. Dimitri, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. So
No
just a small intervention on the hydrogen issue. We've already seen and we've already started having preliminary discussions about hydrogen projects, even in our country of operation, with the existing infrastructure in place. We've discussed with natural gas transmission operators of blending hydrogen into the mix, and it is technically feasible, environmentally sound, and safe at the same time. So we do have some preliminary projects there, and we're investigating those. And from our perspective, we're a little bit technology agnostic of how hydrogen is produced, as long as it is economically attractive and justified within a low carbon scenario, because we see other technologies coming in place, and blue hydrogen could have a role to play in the transition phase for certain countries that do not have the necessary renewable capacity yet. Now, going forward in terms of financing, our approach to financing is, as I said in our intervention, it's at a platform level. We need to see the holistic view for the country, the region, the company, and then decide accordingly what is needed and focus on certain key areas that might need more support than others. As Sabine said, with the GCF, we're piloting a program which we call the High Impact, in which we're trying to support companies integrating into their decision-making climate change considerations. And in that sense, that would integrate into their investment decisions, low carbon roadmaps and technology scenarios that they would need to take into account now, right? And that would be part of our conditional finance, that they need to take this into account now, so that they start investing in considering these in their long-term strategic plans, whether they're 5 to 10 years. So even though I think from a financing point of view, our time horizon is given, which means we give our finance with a certain period of time, our actual impact would have to go beyond that time financing horizon to make an impact to the corporates going up to 2040 or 2050. And I think that is what we're trying to address with our new financing scheme based on this industrial decarbonization platform. Extend corporates' vision beyond our time financing and kind of bind them to implement and take on board climate change into their business considerations. The specific financing schemes will be discussed based on the needs of the company, based on the needs of the corporates. There will be certain needs for intervention and support in some early projects and some early transition countries to address some of the barriers, whether they're market or technological, or even credit, or even environmental risks. But from a multilateral development point of view, as a development bank, which has a strong record in climate finance and in green finance, we are ready to support accordingly within our capacity and mandate.
Thanks, Dimitri. Sabine, is there anything you want to add?
I think Dimitri covered everything, and I think the whole part is, I just wanted to add on this is, the story of the hydrogen story is actually a little bit different this time around, and I think the part where we need to really focus on is on the demand side of things. There is a latent demand that's coming up, and then there are different areas where we are really looking at hydrogen as a replacement for other fossils that are coming up, especially on the fuel side of things. So, and that's where I think we would also be really looking at from the GCF side is seeing how do we come in on the financing side to really make that demand happen, and then really kind of use our funds either as a de-risking instrument or as a partial equity play to really get that capital moving to get that to get the demand in place. So I think that's where we should be focused on, and I think that's where we would really like to see the story going, because if the demand happens, then then the supply will also come as well, and I think that's the story that we've seen in solar as well, and then I think that's the thing that should happen in hydrogen as well. I think I will leave it at that. I think we're coming to an end.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Sabine. So we are coming up close to end of time, and we have a hard stop at 9:30, which means the system will kick us off right then. But I think we have time for one more question if we make it quick. And I see a question came in. How do we make decarbonization of industry appealing to developing countries? And I think we've been talking about that a lot. But when you look at sort of the really developing countries with sort of industries developing over time, and there's a lot of capacity to build. It sort of seems like we're talking about making things attractive from the outset and really designing, helping them develop business models. But in 1 minute, does anyone want to jump on that? Maybe I'll turn to Ajay with his experience, and maybe then back to Sabine. Just very quickly, how do we make this decarbonization appealing to the lower developed countries?
So the issue, as you have very rightly said, is that new capacity that is coming up adopts this to start with. It makes sense for them, and then in order to compete with them, the people who have invested in fossil fuel technology change over so that they have the lower operating costs also. So programs that help the newcomers to adopt not only a more efficient, but tomorrow's technologies is the key to changing the stock of technological ownership in developing countries.
I mean, just to add on to Dr. Mathur's point, I think the only part I think we would really need to do is also build in, policy measures that are actually favor the use of these technologies that with fiscal
absolutely
and that yeah.
So, for example, Sabine, in India, you have the Perform, Achieve, and Trade program, in which companies get targets of reduced energy consumption per ton of product every 3 years. Supposing we said that instead of just energy saving, they could get an energy saving certificate, or they could get a carbon saving certificate. Suddenly you're provided.
Man, that the technology is cruel today. It cut you off right as you were getting into it. But I think as we are running out of time, that may be a good place to leave it, because it's clear that we could go on for hours and hours on this topic. Clearly, it's a very dynamic space, and I just really want to take the opportunity to thank our presenters for an excellent discussion. Really rich, lots of content here, and for those attending, I would say just keep an eye on this space. There's going to continue to be innovation, going to continue to be lots of good stuff coming out. Thank you all for attending, and again, thanks to the panelists for their insights.
Thank you very much for the organization and for the presentation. Thank you to all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
everybody.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everybody. Back to my beer.
Good call, Sabine.
All right, man.